Friends, I want to talk with you tonight about something very big, very historic, and very difficult. The title of my talk is that after tonight, Israel will never be the same, and I don't mean that as hyperbole. I mean that we are witnessing a society, an economy, and a political structure that has reached a breaking point. The kind of breaking point that, once crossed, cannot be reversed. History does not give do-overs. Once the contradictions of a system come to the surface, they have to be addressed. If they are ignored, they don't go away, they deepen, and they force transformations, whether people like it or not. Israel today is at such a crossroads. Its economy is under immense strain, its politics are more fractured than ever before, and its society is divided into communities that increasingly cannot see one another as part of the same nation. This is not sustainable, and history shows us what happens when contradictions reach this level. So, in this first session, I want to set the stage. I want to look at Israel's trajectory, where it came from, how its economic and political model developed, and what contradictions have been piling up to bring us to this historic moment. Let's start with the economy. When Israel was founded in 1948, it had a very particular economic structure. It was a mixed economy with heavy state involvement. Large parts of production, land, and infrastructure were collectively owned or operated through the state or quasi-public institutions like the Histadrut, which was the dominant trade union, but also an economic player in its own right. This collectivist, state-led model was not an accident. It was necessary. Israel was a small, isolated country surrounded by hostile neighbors, dependent on waves of immigration and lacking natural resources. To survive, it needed massive state planning, redistribution, and coordination, and for decades that worked. Israel built up infrastructure, absorbed immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and developed its agricultural and industrial base. It was not a neoliberal free market paradise. It was a carefully managed hybrid. But as with so many societies, that model began to shift in the 1980s and 1990s under pressure from global capitalism, from the United States, from the IMF, from multinational corporations. Israel liberalized, it privatized state industries, cut back on subsidies, deregulated finance, and opened itself to global capital flows. The startup nation narrative, the idea of Israel as a hub of high-tech innovation, was built on this shift. What this meant was twofold. On the one hand, Israel became a global player in tech, cybersecurity, and venture capital. But on the other hand, inequality skyrocketed. The earlier promise that the state would integrate diverse populations, provide social welfare, and guarantee security started to erode. By the 2000s and 2010s, Israel had one of the highest inequality rates in the developed world. Housing costs soared, wages stagnated for many. The startup nation enriched a small elite, often tied to the military-industrial complex, while leaving large parts of the population behind. So the economic story is one of a society that began with collective survival, then moved into neoliberal integration with global capitalism, and in doing so, created deep internal divisions. Now, let's overlay politics. Israel has always been politically complex. From the beginning, it was a settler colonial project in conflict with the indigenous Palestinian population. that contradiction was never resolved. It was managed, sometimes through war, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through occupation, but never resolved. Internally, Israeli politics were shaped by divisions between Ashkenazi Jews of European origin and Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Later waves of immigration, Russian, Ethiopian, and others, added new layers. For decades, the Labour Party dominated politics, representing the secular Ashkenazi socialist-leaning elite. But beginning in the 1970s, the right wing, spearheaded by Likud, rose to power, channeling resentment from Mizrahi Jews and religious communities who felt excluded by the labor establishment. Benjamin Netanyahu is the culmination of that transformation. His brand of politics, nationalist, neoliberal, and deeply polarizing, has dominated Israel for more than 2 decades. He represents the merging of economic neoliberalism with political authoritarianism. But here's the contradiction. This political system relies on perpetual crisis. It needs enemies, external enemies, like Palestinians, Arabs, and Iranians, and internal enemies, like the liberal elites or the judiciary, to justify its hold on power. That constant mobilization of fear and division works for a while, but it erodes the capacity of society to function. It turns politics into permanent war, where compromise becomes impossible. And so we arrive today at a situation where the political system is paralyzed. Netanyahu is clinging to power despite corruption charges. The opposition is fragmented. The judiciary is under attack. Protest movements are erupting in the streets, and the state cannot govern with legitimacy. Finally, let's consider society. Israeli society is not one society, it is multiple societies stitched together uneasily. You have secular Jews, religious Jews, ultra-Orthodox communities, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi divides, immigrants from Russia and Ethiopia, and of course the 20% of the population that is Palestinian, Arab citizens of Israel. These groups live in different neighborhoods, send their children to different schools, often speak different languages, and vote for different parties. In many cases, they barely interact. What has held this fragmented society together has been 2 things. The sense of external threat, the idea that Israel is surrounded and must unite for survival, and the promise of economic advancement, that Israel is a modern, dynamic economy with opportunities for all. But now both of those adhesives are cracking. The external threat narrative is less convincing to younger generations who see the occupation not as a defensive necessity, but as an ongoing moral and political disaster. And the economic promise has faltered as inequality has grown and housing and wages have become unbearable. So society itself is fragmenting. People are retreating into their own communities, mistrusting one another, and increasingly unwilling to see themselves as part of a common project. Now, you may be wondering, why do I say that after tonight, Israel will never be the same? What makes this moment so decisive? It is because the contradictions I have described, economic, political, and social, are converging. They are no longer separate pressures that can be managed individually. They are reinforcing one another. The economy is feeding the politics of division. The politics of division are deepening the social fractures are undermining the economy. This is the classic recipe for systemic crisis. And systemic crises do not end with a return to the status quo. They force transformation. We don't yet know what form that transformation will take. It could be authoritarian consolidation, an even harsher regime doubling down on militarism and neoliberalism, or it could be rupture, mass mobilization from below that forces a new political and economic arrangement. But what is clear is that the old Israel, the Israel of the startup nation, the Israel of endless occupation, and yet endless international legitimacy, the Israel of fragmented but somehow stable politics, that Israel is over. History has moved. The contradictions have become unmanageable. And after tonight, Israel will never be the same. So in this first session, we have set the table. We have looked at the economic trajectory, the political evolution, and the social fragmentation of Israel. We see how each of these areas is in crisis and how together they form a systemic contradiction that cannot continue. In the next session, we will look more closely at the economic dynamics, particularly inequality, housing, and the role of militarism and high tech, and how they are driving the current moment. For now, remember, history teaches us that societies built on unresolved contradictions eventually face a reckoning. And Israel tonight is at that reckoning. Friends, to grasp why I say Israel will never be the same after tonight, we have to think historically, we have to think economically, and we have to think in terms of contradictions that accumulate over decades until they become unbearable. Nothing about this moment arrived suddenly. It is the product of a long trajectory of choices made by governments, by elites, by corporations, by military planners, and yes, by ordinary citizens who navigated this system, sometimes resisting, sometimes accommodating, often surviving. And what we are witnessing is the accumulation of unresolved contradictions bursting through the surface. You see, Israel was built in a moment of enormous global transformation after the Second World War, in the shadow of the Holocaust, in the midst of decolonization. It presented itself as both a haven for Jews worldwide and as a Western-aligned outpost in the Middle East. Those dual roles carried promises but also contradictions. The promise was security and prosperity for Jewish immigrants arriving from shattered Europe, from hostile Arab regimes, from the Soviet Union, later from Ethiopia. The contradiction was that this project was built on land already inhabited, already claimed by Palestinians. That contradiction from 1948 onward has never been resolved, only managed, sometimes with brutal force, sometimes with negotiation, but always unresolved. The economy of Israel is a telling story of how societies change when global capitalism changes. In the early decades, survival required collective effort. Immigrants needed housing, food, jobs, health care. The state had to step in, had to control resources, had to plan, and people accepted that because it was literally about survival. That model produced real achievements. Literacy soared, universities were built, industries emerged. But in the 1980s, as neoliberalism swept the globe under Reagan and Thatcher, Israel was pulled into the orbit of financial capitalism. Privatization was presented as modernization. Deregulation was sold as efficiency. Suddenly, the rhetoric shifted from building a society to competing in global markets. And here is where the inequality begins. The high-tech elite flourished. Venture capital poured in. Tel Aviv became a hub of startups. But who got left behind? Ordinary workers, Mizrahi Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox communities who did not fit into the model of global entrepreneurship. They bore the costs of austerity, of housing bubbles, of stagnant wages. When you have an economy that rewards a small minority with global prestige and condemns the majority to struggle, you are laying the foundation for explosive political discontent. And we see that discontent in the protests, in the polarization, in the endless cycles of election after election, coalition after coalition, none of them stable. Netanyahu, more than any other figure, embodies this contradiction. He is the champion of neoliberal economics, friendly to billionaires, to privatization, to foreign investors. At the same time, he presents himself as the nationalist defender of the Jewish state, the strong man who alone can protect Israel from enemies. He has convinced millions that these two identities are compatible, the global capitalist and the local nationalist. But in reality, they pull against each other. You cannot serve the interests of global finance and also claim to serve the interests of ordinary citizens who are priced out of housing, burdened by debt, and excluded from the prosperity that finance delivers. That contradiction is tearing Israeli politics apart. And then there is the society itself. We must be honest. Israel is not one people, not one culture, not one community. It is a patchwork. Ashkenazi Jews dominate the economy and culture, but Mizrahi Jews remember decades of marginalization. Russian immigrants brought their own political leanings, often nationalist and secular. Ethiopian immigrants face racism and exclusion. Ultra-Orthodox communities demand subsidies and autonomy. Palestinian citizens, a fifth of the population, live with systematic discrimination. This is not a society that has solved its internal divisions. It has layered them, papered over them, pretended they are manageable, and for decades, the glue holding this patchwork together has been twofold. First, the external enemy, the perpetual threat that demands unity against Palestinians, Arabs, Iranians. And second, the promise of growth, of modernity, of Israel as a successful Western-style society in the Middle East. But those adhesives are failing. Young people question the narrative of external threat. They see endless occupation, endless war, endless militarism, and they ask, is this really security? Or is it permanent conflict? And the economic promise feels hollow when wages stagnate, when apartments in Tel Aviv are beyond reach, when inequality is among the highest in the OECD. So tonight, what is happening is not just another flare-up, not just another crisis in a long line of crises. This is different because the contradictions are converging. The economic inequality fuels political anger. The political paralysis deepens social mistrust. The social divisions undermine economic development. Everything is feeding on everything else, producing a spiral that cannot stabilize. When I say Israel will never be the same, I mean that the illusion of stability is gone. For years, Israeli leaders could project to the world and to their own citizens that despite the conflicts, despite the wars, despite the protests, the system was fundamentally stable. But it is no longer convincing. The mass protests against judicial reform, the repeated electoral deadlocks, the corruption trials of Netanyahu, the rising cost of living, the growing refusal of young people to accept the status quo, These are not isolated events. They are signs of systemic breakdown. And history teaches us something crucial. When contradictions accumulate to this degree, the system must change. It cannot return to what it was. The only question is what form the change will take. Will it be authoritarian, with more repression, more militarism, more concentration of wealth and power justified by the claim of existential threat? Or will it be democratic and transformative, pushed by mass movements demanding equality, justice, and an end to occupation? We cannot know yet, but we can say with confidence that the old model is finished. The startup nation myth, the idea that Israel can be both a neoliberal capitalist hub and a cohesive society, is shattered. The promise that occupation can be managed indefinitely without tearing the society apart is broken. The belief that divisions can be held together by external threats is collapsing. This is why, after tonight, Israel will never be the same, because history is not just about leaders and armies. It is about structures of economy, of politics, of society, and those structures are cracking. Once they crack, they cannot be glued back together as they were. They will be reassembled in some new form through struggle, through conflict, through negotiation, but never again will Israel be what it was in the decades past. And this is not unique to Israel. Every society faces its contradictions. The United States faces them in inequality, in racial injustice, in climate disaster. Europe faces them in austerity, in migration crises, in the rise of the far right. Israel is a particularly sharp example. A society built on extraordinary contradictions, now facing the moment when those contradictions cannot be hidden. So tonight, we are witnesses to history, not in the sense of a single dramatic event, but in the sense of a turning point, a moment after which the story cannot be told the same way. That is what I mean when I say Israel will never be the same. If we turn now to the economy of Israel in its present form, we can see why the crises unfolding today are not sudden or mysterious, but the logical outcome of decades of economic restructuring. The story begins with neoliberal reforms that were introduced in the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s. These reforms were not unique to Israel. They were part of a global shift under pressure from the United States, international financial institutions, and multinational corporations. What Israel did was to dismantle, piece by piece, the collectivist and state-oriented economic framework of its early years. Public enterprises were privatized. Social spending was curtailed. Markets were liberalized to attract foreign investment. This is what produced the startup nation narrative. The image of Israel as a cutting-edge hub of innovation, technology, and global finance. But like all such stories under capitalism, it was a partial truth hiding deeper contradictions. Yes, there was real innovation, real technological development, and real foreign investment, but the benefits were highly concentrated. A small elite in Tel Aviv and a few other centers reaped enormous gains, while much of the population faced stagnant wages, precarious employment,